Hi, this is Scott Amyx, and I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Amstrup, Chief Scientist for Polar Bear International. Stephen, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me, Scott.
So, Stephen, you have a very interesting story of something that happened on your honeymoon in New Zealand.
Well, my wife and I got married in Dunedin, New Zealand, and we were there for a professional conference on estimating animal numbers. And while there, we met a fellow who was studying little blue penguins, and he invited us to come out on our honeymoon night and tag little blue penguins, which was really quite a fun adventure. And it gave me the honor of being one of the very few people on the planet who's been bitten by both a polar bear, which lives only in the northern hemisphere, and a penguin, which lives only in the southern hemisphere.
Now, the big question is on which side?
Well, one thing I can tell you is I thought the penguin bites were cute.
Okay. Very nice. Now, on a more serious note, you've been studying polar bears for the last 30 years in Alaska as a research wildlife biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey. And you've done many reports and, of course, contributed to a number of peer-reviewed articles. Can you go into more kind of depth around the dependence of polar bears on sea ice and why climate change is threatening their survival in the Arctic?
Sure. I was in charge of polar bear research in Alaska between 1980 and 2010. And during those years, I was looking at pretty much all aspects of polar bear life history, ecology, and that sort of thing. And I was actually fortunate in the early years, I was documenting increases in the population as a result of relief from excessive hunting that had occurred in the 1950s and 60s. Later on, I found that things were changing. The population no longer looked so robust, and as the habitat was declining, we saw those recoveries fading away, and the polar bears becoming stressed because of the loss of sea ice. So polar bears depend, and our research and the research of many others around the world showed that polar bears are dependent entirely on the surface of the sea ice to catch their prey. They feed principally on two species of seals, ringed seals and bearded seals, and those seals live under the floating ice pack, but they come up through the ice to breathe and to give birth to their pups and that sort of thing. And so it's at that interface between the air, the top surface of the ice where the polar bears walk around, the underside of the ice where the seals swim, and then that ice surface. And it's that interface where polar bears are able to catch seals. So you can kind of think of the ice as being the dinner plate for the polar bears. And as the ice has declined, and it's been declining, the northern hemisphere sea ice has been declining at about 13% per decade. And just since the era of satellite observations began in 1979, we've lost an area of summer sea ice about 5 times the size of California. And unfortunately, much of this ice loss is in the very preferred habitats of polar bears, the habitats that are closest to shore, where the water is shallow and most productive. So we went from, in the 1980s and early 1990s, documenting a robust population of polar bears in northern Alaska, to the present day, when the population has been dramatically declining as a result of this sea ice loss. And in fact, in 2015, my colleagues and I published a paper showing that there had been about a 40% decline in the southern Beaufort Sea population in the first decade of the 2000s.
This is just heralding. I mean, the magnitude is so significant. It's difficult for us to even kind of wrap our arms around it. So you mentioned the rate at which Arctic sea ice is melting. Can you talk a little bit about bad sea ice years and what can we expect into the future?
Yeah, it's really important to realize that global warming doesn't mean that every year is going to be just a little bit warmer than the previous year, or that every year is going to have just a little bit less sea ice. because there is still the interannual variations. Some years are cooler, some years are warmer. The same kind of variation that we've always seen in the weather will continue. But that variation will continue over a higher and rising baseline. So what that means is that the frequency of bad years, of bad ice years for polar bears will increase. It has to increase. And that's exactly what we're seeing. In the Beaufort Sea, we're seeing an increasing frequency of years when the ice comes in late and melts early. And the same thing in Western Hudson Bay, which is where Polar Bears International, the organization that I work for, has a great presence. And we've been monitoring the visitations of bears there and communicating with the scientists that have been studying bears there for decades. And they've made it pretty clear that we've seen a significant decline in bears there as well that is directly correlated with the loss of the sea ice.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how the bears are adjusting to this. One of the things that I guess they're adjusting because of the scarcity of food is they're fasting longer. And what's the implication to them, but also the infants that are born?
Yeah, so when polar bears lose their sea ice habitat, they're forced principally onto land. And the best data on this come from Western Hudson Bay, where polar bears now in that population spend about 28 days longer on land than they did just 30 years ago. And scientists working in that population have shown that they lose almost a kilogram or nearly 2 pounds of body weight every day they're on land. So they can come ashore after the ice melts, and then they're faced with a fast because there's very little to eat on land. So they're faced with a fast that is well over 100 days and now is 28 days longer than it historically was. In this particular year, we're counting down, but the sea ice in Hudson Bay has still formed relatively little, and those bears are now, I think, around 140 days of fasting. So one of the things that's really important for people to realize is many will say, oh, well, polar bears feed on the sea ice, but if the ice melts, they'll just come ashore and maybe they'll live like grizzly bears. But the data show that there's very little food on land for the bears to eat. Consequently, they lose this tremendous amount of body weight. But I think there's even better evidence out there, a little experiment that Mother Nature has done for us. If you look across the range of the polar bears often occur offshore on the sea ice in areas where onshore there are grizzly bears. And those grizzly bears are among the smallest and the most widely dispersed. They live at some of the lowest densities of grizzly bears anywhere. They're very small. Polar bears are the largest bears in the world. So why would we think that we could move populations of the largest bears in the world into areas that currently support only very small numbers of small bears? It just doesn't seem to make sense. And so we know from that type of evidence that there's little on land for bears to eat, for polar bears to eat. And so the longer they're put on shore, the longer they have to fast. And the first impact of that is survival of their young. Female polar bears that are adults and in good shape may be able to survive bad ice years for at least a while. But they have to have not only enough energy to support themselves and keep themselves going, they have to be able to nurse their cubs. And if they don't have enough to do both, it's the cubs that lose out. And that, in fact, is what we're seeing in both northern Alaska and in Hudson Bay, where the survival of cubs during their first year of life, when they would be relying on their mother's milk, has been dramatically reduced.
So just to help the listeners and the viewers connect more on a kind of a personal level, can you share with us throughout the decades that you've been observing and studying them, a specific story, maybe a specific polar bear or a family that you tracked and how you've seen that particular nucleus change and survive or maybe even die over time.
Well, unfortunately, because of following bears, the only way we really can effectively follow individual bears or their families is through radio telemetry and putting radio collars on the animals and then following them around. And those radio collars typically only last for a year or sometimes 2 years. So we often don't get the opportunity to follow the long-term success of individual polar bears. I was able to do that in the 80s and early 90s. And there we found that at a time when about 10 to 12% of the population was yearling animals, animals that had survived their first year of life, the first year survival was about 65%. That was when things were really good. Now we're down to about half that number. Now, to follow an individual bear, unfortunately, I can't say how many times we have had very limited opportunity to do that. But we know from the statistics population-wide that the survival of these young bears is really poor. And that's what's really important, is what is happening at the population level. Because even now, there are some females that in most years are still very productive. But you know, there's kind of like a bell-shaped curve in the ability of these animals to survive and to nurture their cubs. Some of them are better hunters, some of them are not so good. And the ones that are not so good get weaned out earlier. The point, though, I think that we have to keep in mind is there's this fundamental tie between access to sea ice and the prey that are out there and long-term polar bear persistence. And if we don't maintain sea ice, we are going to lose polar bears.
Okay, so we'll come back to the sea ice in just a second. Let's talk just real briefly about when the polar bears are coming on land and staying on land longer, how is that colliding with human civilization? And I think in the past, we've seen articles and coverage of bears actually literally ransacking small villages in the Arctic region. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, that's a really important question. You know, as we've been talking, polar bears are fundamentally threatened by an ever-warming world. But as the world is warming and the sea ice is declining, one thing we're seeing is these bears that are spending now more time on land and they're getting hungrier, they're not just going to lay down and die. You know, they're going to go looking for food, and often that brings them into communities, into villages, into hunting camps and that sort of things. And one of the symptoms of that is increased bear-human conflict. And unfortunately, oftentimes when polar bears and humans have a conflict situation, the polar bears end up getting shot. Sometimes humans end up getting killed or injured, which of course is a tragedy of the greatest magnitude. But the important thing is that this is one symptom of this declining sea ice. A lot of places that never used to see polar bears, in fact, on the North Slope of Alaska, you know, there's major oil fields centered in Prudhoe Bay. And when I first started working in northern Alaska in the 1980s, many of the oil field workers said they didn't really believe there were polar bears around because they'd never seen one. They'd been working there for maybe 10 or 15 years. Now there's polar bears on land and in the oil field all the time in the summer. And so things have dramatically changed. And so there's this, not only are polar bears threatened by losing the habitat that allows them to catch their food, they're threatened because of this additional situation where interactions between bears and humans often end up resulting in more dead bears.
So let's talk about solutions and advice. So the fact that there is a declining habitat for polar bears, based on your science research and overall experience, what are the things that we can do from a human action to reverse this?
Yeah, The most critical thing is we need to halt CO2 rise in the atmosphere. We've got this ever increasing concentration of CO2 in our atmosphere that, by the laws of physics, requires the world to warm. We need to halt that. We need to stabilize that. Well, how do we do that? Well, people will suggest we turn down our thermostat, turn off the lights when we leave the room, that sort of thing. But really, we're well beyond the point where that sort of low-hanging fruit can really come to the point where it makes a difference. We need policy action. And how do we achieve policy action? We need to go to the polls and vote for politicians, for policy leaders that have shown that they care about our future. Not just the future of polar bears, because polar bears, in my view, are just an early warning of what's coming to all of us. And so the most important thing is to vote, and to vote with our future, the future of our children and grandchildren in mind. And also vote with your dollars. When you're going to buy something, look at the companies that you're supporting. Are they working on a sustainable business model or working towards a sustainable business model? As you know, we've become an increasingly throwaway society. And so things that we used to think of as long-term goods that we kept around for a while, suddenly now they're so easily just discarded, and we go get something else. And we really need to change that model of how we live in order to make sure that we have not only polar bears into the future, but lots of other things that we care about. And the best way to achieve that is to show our support for those companies and those organizations that actually are already thinking about this and working towards a sustainable lifestyle.
Great. So just to recap is that though for some of the listeners are probably thinking this is very specific to polar bears, the reality is that polar bear is an early indicator or leading indicator of what's to come for mankind as well as other species on Earth. We know that Earth is going to be just fine from a planet. It will recycle itself, but the habitats and then the species, including us on it, are in jeopardy unless we decide to do something with our dollars and our votes. So that was advice from Dr. Stephen Amstrup, who is the chief scientist for Polar Bear International. Dr. Amstrup, thank you for joining today.
Thanks so much. I appreciated the chance to visit with you.